The video was 17 seconds long. A laughing crowd, a boy with his hand already moving, and then a woman standing in the middle of it all, bareheaded, perfectly still, looking at him with an expression that made people pause mid-scroll and watch it again. Nobody could quite explain what unsettled them about her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't tears. It was something quieter than both, and somehow more dangerous than either. Within hours, millions had seen it. Within days, they would learn that the boy had made a mistake that reached far beyond one afternoon at a shopping promenade, because the woman he had chosen to humiliate in front of the world wasn't just standing there. She was already 3 moves ahead. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Westfield Promenade on a Saturday afternoon was the kind of place that made you feel like the world was doing just fine. Flower boxes lined the cobblestone walkways. Music drifted out of boutique storefronts. People moved in slow, easy patterns, shopping bags swinging, coffee cups in hand, sunglasses catching the light. Everything felt curated. Everything felt safe. Nia Brooks moved through it all like water, finding its level. She wasn't hurrying. She never really hurried. She walked with the kind of quiet deliberateness that came from years of training herself not to waste motion. Not in her steps, not in her words, not in her reactions. She wore a cream-colored linen blazer over a simple black dress, low heels, a thin gold chain at her throat. Her wig, a sleek dark style cut just below her jaw, sat neatly in place. To anyone watching, she was just a well-dressed woman enjoying an afternoon. But Nia was rarely just anything. Her eyes moved steadily as she walked. She noticed the security camera above the entrance to the Italian restaurant on her left, its angle slightly off, covering the seating area, but missing the alley beside the kitchen. She noticed the couple near the fountain who had been arguing quietly for at least 10 minutes, the woman's posture tight, the man's jaw set. She noticed the teenager near the smoothie kiosk who had pocketed something while the cashier looked away. Noticing was second nature to her. It had been for a long time. Her phone buzzed. She stepped to the side of the walkway, just past a potted olive tree, and answered. "I've got the last quarter of the document set ready," the voice on the other end said. A man's voice, calm, efficient. Her colleague, Derek. "The timeline is coming together. The overlaps are exactly where we expected." "Good." Nia's voice was low, unhurried. "What's the gap between the subsidiary filings and the public disclosures?" 14 months on the Hargrove deal. 11 on the Western portfolio transfer. She let that sit for a moment. That's not accidental sloppiness. That's a system. That's what I keep saying. Send it all to the secure folder. I want to go through it tonight. She paused, watching a woman push a stroller past her without looking up. And pull the board appointment dates again. I want to cross them against the acquisition windows. Already on it. She hung up, stood still for just a second, organizing the information in her mind the way she organized everything, quietly, methodically, without fanfare. Then she started walking again. She was heading toward the small bookshop at the end of the promenade. She had a habit of buying one paperback novel a week. Something about holding a physical book helped her separate her work brain from whatever was left of everything else. It was a small ritual, but it was hers. She heard them before she saw them. The laughter was the first thing, loud and self-congratulatory, the kind that announces itself across a crowd. Then the commentary. Then the sound of a phone camera shutter clicking repeatedly. A group of teenage boys had taken over a stretch of the walkway near the central courtyard. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, all wearing variations of the same expensive casual uniform. Sneakers that cost more than most people's rent, hoodies with small designer logos, hairstyled with careful carelessness. The kind of boys who had grown up in spaces that kept telling them they were the most interesting people in any room. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered for his age, with sandy hair and a smirk that seemed to have been installed permanently, was holding his phone up, narrating into the camera while his friends circled around him. He was performing, clearly. Everything about his posture said he was always performing. Okay, watch this one," he was saying. He had already knocked a woman's shopping bag off her arm and pretended it was an accident, laughing while she bent to gather her things. One of his friends filmed it. Another uploaded it before she'd even stood back up. Nia took note of them, adjusted her path slightly to give them a wider berth. She had learned long ago that there was no point engaging with that particular species of teenage boy in that particular kind of mood. They were looking for a reaction. Everything they were doing was engineered to produce one. She was almost past them when the tall one, Ethan, though she didn't know his name yet, turned and saw her. She noticed a shift in his expression. Something calculating moved through his eyes for just a fraction of a second. Then the smirk widened. He stepped directly into her path. Oh, sorry, he said, his hands going up in exaggerated innocence, even though she had stopped in time and they hadn't actually collided. Didn't see you there. His friends snickered. One of them was already raising a phone. Nia looked at him steadily. You're fine, she said, simple and neutral, and moved a step around him. He stepped with her, blocking again. Nah, wait. He turned to his friends, grinning. Doesn't she look like she's going somewhere important? More laughter. Someone made a comment she didn't catch. It didn't matter. Excuse me, Nia said, still calm, still measured. I'm just saying. Ethan started, looking her over with the particular laziness of someone who had never once been told to stop. Where you headed? You look like you're trying really hard. The crowd nearby had begun to slow. Not stopping, but slowing. The way people do when they sense something about to happen and can't decide whether to walk away or watch. Nia looked at him. His eyes. His posture. The phone pointed at her from 3 feet away. She had done risk assessments on billion-dollar corporations. She could read a room, a document, a person. This boy had grown up knowing that nothing stuck to him. That was visible in every line of him. She said nothing, simply looked at him with an expression that was completely, utterly calm. Something about that seemed to irritate him more than any response would have. The smile tightened slightly. He glanced at his friends, one of whom gave him an encouraging nod. And then, without warning, without hesitation, as though it were the most casual thing in the world, Ethan reached out and yanked the wig from her head. It came off cleanly. He held it up in the air for a second, his friends erupting in laughter, some of the bystanders gasping. Then he walked 3 steps and dropped it into the open trash beside the nearest bench. There you go, he said, turning back to her with a smirk at full power. Now you look more. He didn't finish the sentence, because when he turned, Nia was looking at him, not shouting, not crying, not lunging for the trash can or him, just looking at him. The crowd had gone very quiet. Her scalp was bare. She stood exactly. He had bigger things to manage. What he did not know was that 40 minutes away, in a different kind of office entirely, a woman was not managing a distraction. She was building a case. Nia's apartment occupied the top floor of a building that didn't advertise itself. There was no concierge, no imposing lobby. The building's exterior looked ordinary, deliberately so. The apartment itself was clean, organized, and dense with work. 3 large monitors on a deep desk. Filing systems that appeared, at first glance, to be personal organization and revealed themselves, on closer inspection, to be something more rigorous. Whiteboards covered in notation that would have looked like noise to most people. External drives lined up in a specific sequence along a shelf. She sat at her desk in a plain dark sweater, no wig, a mug of tea steaming next to the keyboard. Her scalp showed the uneven patches she had managed quietly for 3 years. The result of alopecia, a condition that had arrived without warning and settled in with the permanence of a house guest who didn't intend to leave. She had grieved it in private. She had adjusted. She rarely thought about it directly anymore, except on days when the world decided to make it their business. She was cross-referencing 2 sets of financial filings. The Callaway Group had 17 subsidiary companies registered across 5 states. 3 of them had overlapping board appointments. 2 of those 3 had been acquired through a holding structure that appeared nowhere in the parent company's public disclosures. Nia had been working on this for 7 months. She had a methodology, slow, precise, layered, that built a picture one tile at a time until the image became impossible to deny. She was not impulsive. She did not move until she was sure. She had been sure for about 3 weeks. What happened at the promenade had not changed her timeline significantly, but it had changed something about the quality of her patience. She was still calm, but now the calm had a direction. Her door buzzed at 10:30. She already knew who it was. Maya Brooks was 30, a full 3 years younger than her sister, and carried herself with an energy that was the photographic negative of Nia's stillness. Quick-moving, openly expressive, wearing her feelings on the outside the way other people wore clothes. She came in holding a tote bag and a box of pastries and set both on the kitchen counter with more force than was necessary. I watched it 6 times, Maya said. Not as an opener, but as a continuation of a conversation she had apparently already been having with herself in the car. 6 times. And each time I watched it, I felt something new and none of it was good. Sit down, Nia said from the desk. I'm standing. Okay. Maya turned to face her. Her eyes were bright with that particular kind of feeling that lives just between anger and heartbreak. You stood there. And she stopped. Are you okay? Nia looked at her sister for a moment. Yes. Don't do that. Do what? Say yes like that when you mean something more complicated. Nia exhaled through her nose, not quite a sigh. It was humiliating, she said, simply. In public, in front of strangers, for entertainment. So no, it didn't feel like nothing. But I'm okay. Maya pressed her lips together. She looked at the monitors, at the files, at the boards. She had been here enough times to know what she was looking at, even if she didn't know the specific details. Tell me you already had this in motion, she said. Tell me this isn't just 7 months, Nia said. I've been building this for 7 months. Something in Maya's posture released slightly. Then she said, the Hargrove deal? Among others. Nia. Maya moved closer to the desk. I've had Callaway corporate documents in my hands before. Do you remember that? Do you remember what happened? Nia looked at her directly. That was 10 years ago. It's different now. Is it? Because from where I'm standing. Maya. Not sharp. Not dismissive. Just certain. I know what I'm doing. And I know what they did. I have been patient and careful, and I have built something that doesn't collapse under pressure, because I built it right. She let a beat pass. They don't know that yet. But they will. Maya was quiet for a moment. She looked at her sister's face. The bare scalp, the steady eyes, the mug of tea sitting there like an ordinary thing in an extraordinary morning. Then she nodded, slowly. What do you need from me? The old filing I gave you 6 weeks ago. The one from the Western Portfolio acquisition. I've been reviewing it. I want to know if it's actionable as a standalone case. Not attached to everything else I'm building. On its own, Maya understood immediately what that meant. A standalone case could move independently. It could be a door that opened regardless of how the larger structure developed. She nodded again. I'll have an answer by Tuesday. After she left, Nia sat with the quiet for a few minutes. Then she turned back to the monitors. Andre Cole had a rule about stories he covered. He never assumed he was the first person in the room. The best stories were almost always ones where someone else had already done the hard part, and he was there to bear witness. He had built a career on knowing when to move and when to wait, and on trusting that the most significant things happened when the people doing them were ready, not when he was. He had seen the video on Saturday evening. He had watched it in the way he watched most things, with that particular stillness of someone who was looking for what was underneath the surface image. And there it was. Not just an awful kid doing an awful thing. The woman. The way she had stood there. The sentence she had said. The phone call she had made immediately after. He had recognized her. Not from the video. From something else. Andre was 42 and had spent the last 3 years investigating the financial ecosystem of a handful of the country's largest family-held corporations. The Callaway Group was on his list. Had been for a while. He had been stuck, mostly. The paper trails bent in careful directions, and the sources he'd cultivated went quiet whenever he pressed too hard. Nia Brooks had appeared on the edge of his research 8 months ago. Not as a subject, as a reference. A name attached to an inquiry that had been filed with a regulatory body and then quietly closed. He had flagged the name and set it aside. He had not found more at the time. Now he opened his notes and looked at the name again. He did not contact her immediately. That was not how he worked. Instead, he started pulling everything he had on the Callaway Group and looking at it with fresh eyes, looking for the shape of it, the way a building's shadow tells you something about the building structure. He was looking for where her work and his work might already overlap without either of them knowing it. By Monday morning, he thought he could see it. By Tuesday, the first small thing happened. A government audit notice was issued to Callaway Meridian Holdings, one of the smaller subsidiaries in the family portfolio. The kind of audit notice that on its own meant very little. They happened. They were routine. Victor Callaway's legal team received the notice, noted it, and prepared a standard response. What they did not note, because there was no reason to, yet, was that the notice had been requested by a regulatory analyst who had received a document package 7 days earlier from an anonymous, but carefully authenticated source. Victor was irritated when Patricia mentioned it in passing. Handle it, he said. He had 6 other things on his mind. In a conference room across the city, a deal that Callaway Group had been finalizing for 4 months hit an unexpected snag. The other party's lawyers had requested a delay in signing. No explanation given. Victor's team pushed back. The other party's lawyers said their client needed time to review certain materials that had recently come to their attention. Victor was more than irritated about that one. He called the other party's CEO directly. The man was polite, cautious, and said the word materials again without elaborating. Victor hung up and told his team to find out what had gotten into the man's hands. That evening, Nia sat at her desk and opened a new document. She typed a single line across the top of it. Shell Company Register, Callaway Group, cross-referenced with acquisition dates. Below it, she began building a list. The list had 23 entries. She had confirmed 11 of them in full. She was working on the remaining 12. She read through what she had, slowly, the way she always read through things, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, anything that didn't line up. Everything lined up. She leaned back in her chair, looked at the document, whispered to no one, "Let's see how deep this goes." Outside, the city moved on in its ordinary way. People were probably still sharing the video. People were probably still arguing in comment sections about whether it was a big deal or not. Nia closed the document, saved it, locked the drive. Then she made herself another cup of tea and went to bed. She would need her rest. The work was only beginning. The audit notice sitting in Callaway Meridian Holdings' legal inbox was by itself the kind of document that corporate lawyers process with one hand while doing something else with the other. Audit notices arrived. They were answered. They went away. The machine had procedures for them, and the procedures were efficient, and the whole thing typically resolved itself within a few weeks with minimal disruption to anything that actually mattered. Except this one had been requested by a specific analyst at a specific regulatory body, citing a specific cluster of filing inconsistencies that had been documented across a 14-month window. And that kind of specificity, the kind that suggested someone had done the homework before the request was ever filed, was different from routine. The lawyers noted it. They did not yet flag it upward. They were still operating under the assumption that this was manageable. They were good lawyers. They just didn't have the right information yet. Nia was at her desk by 6:30 Wednesday morning, working through the last section of a document that had taken her 2 days to properly decrypt, not in any coded sense, but in the way that financial architecture is its own language, and reading it fluently requires the kind of patience most people don't have. Shell companies were not unusual. Using them for asset transfers was not, by itself, illegal. What made them instruments of fraud was the gap between what was disclosed publicly and what was moved privately. The canyon between the official story and the actual sequence of events. She had found the canyon. She was now measuring its depth. Her connection to the regulatory body was not a back channel in any dramatic sense. She had spent years building credibility with people inside systems. Analysts, mid-level officers, compliance reviewers who were underpaid and overworked, and who, when presented with clean, well-documented evidence, were not inclined to ignore it. She had never bribed anyone. She had never pressured anyone. She had simply become someone whose name, attached to a document package, meant the package was worth reading. That was the kind of influence that didn't photograph well. It didn't make for impressive introductions at parties. But it worked. She was reading through the cross-referenced acquisition dates when her phone lit up. She glanced at it, a number she recognized but hadn't expected. She let it ring once more, then answered. "You found me," she said. "Not hard, when you know where to look." Andre Cole's voice was measured, not aggressive. The voice of someone who was very comfortable with silence and used it strategically. "I've been looking at the Callaway Group for a while." "I know." A pause. "You know, your inquiry into the Western Coast acquisition was dismissed 14 months ago. You filed a follow-up request that also went nowhere. You've been working around the edges since then." She turned away from her monitors. "You're good at what you do. You just didn't have the right entry point." Another pause. Longer this time. "And you do. I have the architecture. I know where the bodies are buried, structurally speaking." "I'm going to ask you directly," Andre said. "Is what happened to the promenade last weekend connected to this?" Nia considered how to answer that. Not because she was being evasive, but because the true answer was more layered than a yes or no. "The investigation was already running," she said finally. "What happened moved my timeline." "How?" "It reminded me that people like Victor Callaway raise people like that boy. That the behavior doesn't come from nowhere. It's taught, through permission, through consequence-free living, through the belief that nothing touches you. I have been patient. I decided I was done being patient." Andre was quiet for a moment. "I want to work with you on this." "I know you do. And I'll think about it." She looked back at the monitors. "Don't publish anything yet. If you move too early, you'll spook them, and they'll spend the next 6 months reorganizing the paper trail. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know how to." "I know what you know," Nia said without sharpness. "I'm not questioning your ability. I'm asking you to trust that I have a specific sequencing in mind, and that breaking the sequence serves no one." Silence again. "Then how long?" "Not long." She paused. "I'll be in touch." She hung up and sat for a moment, looking at nothing. Andre Cole was not a variable she had planned for specifically, but he wasn't unwelcome. A credible investigative journalist at the right moment was not a liability. He was a mechanism. She filed him in her mind in the appropriate place and went back to work. The school that Ethan Callaway attended had a code of conduct document that was 37 pages long. It covered everything from academic integrity to social media use to conduct that reflects negatively on the institution's values and standing. Ethan had read approximately 4 pages of it in 9th grade when it had been required reading during orientation. He had not thought about it since. By Wednesday of that week, the Dean of Student Affairs had thought about it a great deal. The video had made its way through the school's social media ecosystem, which is to say, it had been everywhere by Monday morning, discussed in group chats and cafeteria tables, and the particular rapid-fire commentary of 300 teenagers who had all grown up online and processed the world in real time. The reactions were not uniform. A portion of his classmates thought it was funny. A larger portion, larger than Ethan would have expected, or perhaps larger than he would have admitted to himself, did not. 2 teachers had brought it to the dean's attention independently. A parent had called the school directly. Ethan was called to the office on Wednesday afternoon. He went in the manner of someone who had been called to offices before and had always left them unchanged, relaxed, mildly amused, already composing the text he would send his friends afterward about how the administration had nothing better to do. The dean was a tall, unhurried man named Mr. Garrett who had been at the school for 22 years and had developed the particular patience of someone who had seen every variety of teenage mistake and still believed, stubbornly, that most of them were recoverable. He asked Ethan to sit. He asked Ethan to describe what had happened. Ethan described it in the way he had been describing it all week, with a slight smile, with the language of harmlessness, with the implicit suggestion that the only people who had a problem with it were people who didn't understand humor. Mr. Garrett listened to all of it. Then he said, "What do you know about the woman?" Ethan blinked. "What do you mean?" "The woman in the video. Do you know who she is? What she does? What she was dealing with that day?" Ethan shrugged. "No. So you did something to a stranger, something that touched her body without her consent, that exposed a medical condition she manages privately. And your defense is that it was harmless." Something in the air shifted slightly. Ethan's smile thinned. "It was a wig. It was her body," Mr. Garrett said. "And it wasn't yours to touch." There was a formal letter issued to his parents that evening. Not an expulsion, not yet, but a documented conduct warning that went into his record and required a response from his family within 5 business days. Ethan showed his father the letter over dinner. Victor read it, set it down, and told Patricia to handle it in the morning. He had 4 calls that afternoon that had left him more concerned than he was willing to show. The deal that had stalled was now officially delayed by 2 weeks. A second deal, one that had been moving smoothly through its final stages, had inexplicably gone quiet. 2 phone calls had gone unreturned. Victor was not a man who received unreturned calls. He was a man whose calls others waited for anxiously. He poured himself a drink after dinner and stood at the window of his study looking out at the city. He was not a man given to unease, but something was moving in the periphery of his attention that he couldn't quite name yet. A shift in air pressure, subtle but unmistakable, the way the atmosphere changes just before weather arrives. He told himself he was being paranoid. Poured another drink. Went to bed. Maya Brooks had a small but precise legal practice that operated out of an office above a florist on the west side. She had 2 associates and a paralegal named Donna who had been with her since the beginning and who knew the filing systems better than Maya did. The office smelled faintly of flowers from downstairs and strongly of paper and coffee. Maya did corporate justice work, the kind of legal practice that rarely made headlines but consistently changed things. She had spent a decade building cases for individuals and small businesses who had been consumed by larger entities without their full understanding. She knew what those documents looked like. She knew what the trails looked like. She had spent years learning to trace them. She was also, in ways she didn't always say out loud, doing this work because of something specific. A specific company, a specific acquisition, a specific set of events that had happened to her family when she was 19 years old and that had never, in the 10 years since, been named or addressed or made accountable. She sat in her office Thursday afternoon with the filing Nia had given her 6 weeks earlier open in front of her. She had reviewed it methodically, once for orientation, once for gaps, once for what a court would need to consider it actionable as a standalone case. On this third read, she was writing notes in the margin. What she was looking at was the documentation of a business acquisition that, on paper, appeared routine. A small manufacturing company in Ohio. The kind of mid-sized business that employed 200 people and had been operated by the same family for 30 years, that had been acquired by a Callaway subsidiary in what was presented as a voluntary sale. But voluntary sales had a specific shape. The documents in Maya's hands had a different shape. The shape of a company that had been systematically destabilized, supply contracts disrupted, lending relationships quietly undermined, regulatory compliance issues manufactured. until the owners had no real choice but to sell at a price well below the company's actual value to the only buyer who appeared. The only buyer had been Callaway. Maya had seen this pattern before. She had seen it personally in a different file from a different decade. She set her pen down, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then picked up her phone and called Nia. "It's standalone," she said. "The Ohio case is standalone. I can build a filing around it without touching anything you haven't released yet." "Good," Nia said. "I want to go further," Maya said. "I want to include the Dunmore case alongside it. I know that one is old, but if I can show pattern, the Dunmore case is the one that's close to home." "I know what it is, Nia." A pause. "File the Ohio case first. Let move. We'll talk about Dunmore." Maya looked at the documents again. The Dunmore case was the name they used internally, a kind of shorthand for what had happened to their family's business. Their father had built a small distribution company over 20 years. Careful, steady work. A modest success. A company that paid its employees on time and never overextended. It had been acquired, or more precisely consumed, by a holding structure that connected, if you followed it far enough, to the Callaway empire. Their father had tried to fight it. He had found a lawyer. The lawyer had been quietly approached by someone on the other side and had become, subtly and over time, less useful. The case had collapsed. The company had been absorbed. Their father had spent the next 4 years managing the grief of losing something he had built with his life, and his health had followed the grief downward, and he had died at 61 of a heart attack that the doctors attributed to chronic stress. Maya was 30 years old and had been building toward this moment for the better part of a decade. She was trying very hard to hold it together strategically and not let the personal weight of it make her move too fast. "Ohio first," she said. "Okay. By next week. By Monday." The second strike arrived on Friday. A Callaway real estate subsidiary had been pursuing a major development project, a mixed-use complex in a mid-sized city that represented a significant investment and a 3-year return timeline. The project required municipal approval at a stage that had been, until recently, considered all but certain. 3 city council members had historically been cooperative. One of them, it now emerged, had developed unexpected concerns about the project's financial transparency disclosures. He was requesting a delay in the approval vote pending a review of the project's funding structure. Victor's team got the news at 2 in the afternoon. By 3, Victor himself was on the phone with the council member's office. He was told that the councilman was in a meeting and would call back. He did not call back. Victor had his chief of staff call. The chief of staff was told the same thing. By 5 o'clock, Victor had assembled his senior team in the main conference room. He stood at the head of the table and asked, very quietly, what was happening. His general counsel, a careful man named Robert, said that a document package had apparently been submitted to the councilman's office by an outside party. The package related to the project's funding structure. "What outside party?" Victor asked. Robert said they were trying to determine that. "Find out," Victor said. "Tonight." The meeting ended. Victor stayed in the conference room after everyone else had left. He sat at the long table and looked at the wall. 2 deals stalled. A government audit notice. A municipal approval suddenly complicated. Each thing, on its own, had an explanation. Together, they were forming a shape. He thought about the audit notice again. The specificity of the filing inconsistencies cited. Not random. Someone who had done the homework. He pulled out his phone and searched, for the first time, for the woman from the video. Her name was in the comments. Nia Brooks. He typed it into his contacts database search, the proprietary system his company used for background checks and relationship mapping. The search returned very little. A corporate risk consultant. A few professional references. No social media. No press. No trail of any consequence. He stared at that for a moment. No trail. In his experience, no trail meant one of 2 things. A person of no importance, or a person who knew exactly how to stay invisible. He closed the phone. Sat in the quiet. The shape in the periphery of his attention was becoming more defined. That same Friday evening, Nia met with a contact she had cultivated over 4 years, a woman named Sheila who worked in the compliance division of a financial regulatory agency and who had a specific, careful, principled discomfort with fraud that had made her, over time, receptive to the kind of clean, documented evidence packages that Nia occasionally delivered. They met at a coffee shop that was neither of their neighborhoods. They sat at a corner table and spoke in low voices over cups neither of them was really drinking. Nia slid a folder across the table. "The third subsidiary," she said. "The asset transfer documentation with a cross-reference disclosure timeline." Sheila opened it. Read the first 2 pages with the careful speed of someone for whom this kind of document was native language. Looked up. "This is clean. It's all clean. Everything I've given you has been clean." The gap here is 11 months. On a transfer of roughly 40 million in assets. Nia kept her voice level, and the disclosure, when it did come, listed it under a category that made it effectively invisible to a standard review. Sheila looked back at the document. I need to take this to my supervisor. I expected that. It'll take a few days. I know. Nia folded her hands on the table. There's no rush. I just need it in the right hands. She walked home after the meeting. It was a cool evening, clear sky, the city in that brief Friday evening mood where everyone seemed slightly lighter than they did at noon. She thought about Victor Calloway, sitting somewhere in his expensive house, reviewing his expensive problems and not yet understanding what they meant. She thought about her father, about the company he had built and what had been done to it, about the particular kind of loss that comes not from disaster but from deliberate engineered erosion, someone quietly pulling the supports out from under something you built with your life, then stepping back to watch it fall and calling it the market. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel angry. She felt mostly like someone who was doing something that needed to be done in the way that it needed to be done without shortcuts. She went home, made dinner, reviewed the shell company register one more time before she went to sleep. The list now had 18 confirmed entries out of 23. She was close. The article that ran on the following Monday morning was not Andre Cole's. It was a shorter piece from financial news outlet, a paragraph and a half, buried in a roundup of business news, noting that the Callaway Group's municipal development approval had been delayed pending a transparency review. The piece was careful, factual, dry, the kind of thing that financial readers scroll past unless they're specifically watching a company. But it linked, in its last line, to the viral video, not in any analytical sense, simply noting that the Callaway family had recently attracted public attention following a social media incident involving the family's teenage son. The connection was casual, parenthetical. It was enough. By mid-morning, 3 larger outlets had picked up the development story and had not been casual about the connection at all. The narrative had a shape now that was difficult to look away from. A powerful family whose teenage son had publicly humiliated a black woman, dismissing consequences, now facing questions about their business practices. The two stories fed each other. The tone of coverage shifted from amusement at the viral clip to something more interrogative, more sustained. Entitled Family Under Scrutiny was the headline on one outlet. Another went with Callaway Group faces regulatory questions amid PR fallout. A third ran a longer piece with a sidebar about Ethan's video, treating the whole thing as a portrait of a family that operated without accountability. Victor saw the headlines from his car on the way to the office. He called Patricia twice. Patricia was already managing 17 simultaneous crises with the precision of someone who had been in damage control long enough to have developed a kind of dark calm about it. We need to get ahead of this, he told her. We're already behind it, she said. The question is how far. Issue a statement about the development project. Transparency, cooperation, commitment to proper process. The usual structure. I'll draft it. But Victor, the video is still circulating. Every piece about the business mentions it. As long as that connection exists in the public mind, every story about the company reads through that lens. Then we address the video. An apology? Victor was quiet for a moment. A statement, not an apology. Ethan is 17. We express that we hold our family to high standards and that appropriate conversations have occurred at home. Patricia was quiet in the way of someone choosing not to say what she was thinking. I'll send you a draft within the hour. The stock was down 1.8% by noon. Small by the standards of market fluctuation and easily attributable to the general mood of the sector that week. Victor's investment team said as much in a brief note. Victor read the note and agreed with the framing and did not feel reassured. Ethan had started, tentatively, in the way that people start things they don't want to fully acknowledge, to feel the edges of something uncomfortable. It had begun at school, not with anyone saying anything directly to him. The social dynamics of his world were too mediated for that kind of directness. It was subtler. Group chats that had previously been fast and active when he posted had slowed. 2 of his closer friends, the ones who had been there at the promenade, who had filmed and uploaded, were suddenly very busy with things. One of them had posted, without comment, a vague caption about knowing better that Ethan was fairly sure was obliquely about that day. He had texted asking what it meant. He had not received a reply. A brand account that had been in early conversations with him about a collaboration, a streetwear company that had reached out after he'd gained a few thousand followers the previous month, had sent a brief, formal email saying they were going in a different direction with their ambassador strategy. The email was polite and generic. He had read it 3 times. His follower count had peaked and was now declining by a few hundred a day. The comments on the video had shifted. Where there had been laughing emojis and supportive messages, there were now more of the other kind. Not in overwhelming numbers, but consistently, persistently building. He had not told his parents about the brand email. He was sitting in his room on Monday evening, phone in hand, scrolling without purpose, when his mother knocked and came in. Margaret Calloway was a woman who had spent her adult life perfecting the art of looking unruffled. She had the bearing of someone who had attended a great many functions at which image was currency and had accumulated a wealth of it. She sat on the edge of his desk chair and looked at her son with an expression that was carefully composed, but carried, underneath the surface, something more complicated. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Fine," Ethan said. "The school letter," she said. "Your father and I will address that with Mr. Garrett's office this week. I don't want you to worry about it." "I'm not worried about it." Margaret looked at him. He was looking at his phone. "Ethan," he looked up. "I need you to understand that right now, everything our family does is being watched. Everything you do, I should say. I know. What happened at the promenade? Mom, I know." His voice was not angry. It was tired in a specific way, the tiredness of someone who keeps being told to think about something they've decided to be done thinking about. "It was a prank. It got out of hand. I get it." Margaret looked at him for a moment longer. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There were things she had been managing for a long time. Not just Ethan's behavior, but her husband's business, their public image, the architecture of a life built carefully on top of things she had learned not to look at directly. She had become very good at not looking directly at things. It was a survival skill she had developed and perfected and occasionally despised in herself. "Try to stay off social media for a few days," she said finally. "Just until things settle." She left. Ethan looked at the ceiling. The message came through Nia's professional contact form. The subject line read, "Request for conversation, Margaret Calloway." The body was brief, formally worded, requesting a private meeting, suggesting that there was room for a constructive resolution that serves everyone's interests. Nia read it once. Then she typed a reply. "You didn't listen in public. You don't get to talk in private." She sent it. Then she closed the email and returned to the document she had been working on. She had expected the Calloways to try to contact her at some point. It was what they did. When things got uncomfortable, they reached for their preferred tools. Money, private negotiation, the suggestion that a quiet settlement was more dignified than a public fight. They had used those tools for decades. Those tools had worked for decades. She felt no anger reading the message, no satisfaction in refusing it. It was simply a signal that they were feeling the pressure, that the pressure was working, that the structure she had built over 7 months of careful, quiet work was doing what she had built it to do. Andre's first article ran on Tuesday. It was not the bombshell piece. He was disciplined enough to know that the bombshell piece needed to wait. But it was something, a precisely documented, carefully sourced piece about the Calloway Group's regulatory history over the past 6 years. It covered 3 instances of compliance violations that had been quietly resolved, 2 cases where regulatory review had been initiated and then, for reasons not fully explained in the public record, discontinued. It did not allege fraud directly. It simply laid out a pattern of friction between the company and the oversight systems meant to govern it, and asked, in the understated prose of good investigative journalism, what that pattern suggested. The piece was shared 17,000 times in its first 24 hours. It was linked in the comments of every major outlet that was covering the Calloway story. Within 48 hours, 2 additional journalists had contacted Andre asking if he was working on a follow-up. He was. Victor read the article in the back of his car, jaw tight, and called his general counsel before he had finished it. "Find out what he has," he said. "Find out where it's coming from." Robert was quiet for a moment. "We've been looking at that. The sourcing is clean, nothing that points to an internal breach. It's all based on public filings. Nobody finds those connections in public filings without a map. That's what concerns me. The map." Victor sat with that word. Someone had built a map. Someone who understood the architecture well enough to give a journalist precise coordinates. He thought again about the name. Nia Brooks. The minimal footprint. The clean professional references. "Pull everything you can find on Nia Brooks," he told Robert. "Everything. Whatever you have to do." What Victor did not know, because the timing of information is everything, was that at that exact moment, a different document was making its way through a different set of hands. An internal email chain. 14 exchanges over a 3-week period between Victor and a senior executive named Daniel Ferris, discussing the specific restructuring of the Western Portfolio subsidiary in terms that were, to put it plainly, incompatible with the public disclosures filed during that same period, had found its way out of the Calloway Group's internal system. How it had found its way out was a question that would occupy Victor's security team for a long time. The short answer was that Daniel Ferris had kept a personal copy of everything. Daniel Ferris had been Victor's founding partner and had been pushed out of the company 7 years ago in a manner that had been, by any honest accounting, designed to minimize his compensation at a critical moment. Daniel Ferris had been patient. He had been waiting for a moment when his copies would matter. He had reached out, not to Andre directly. That would have been too visible, but through a chain of intermediaries that had eventually connected to Nia's network. Nia received the document package on Tuesday afternoon. She opened it, read it, sat very still for a long time. Then she called Andre. "I have something new," she said. "Don't publish yet, but I need you to see it." How significant? Significant enough to change the shape of the story. She paused. She was thinking about sequencing, about what order to move in, about the difference between exposing quickly and exposing well. She needed the legal filings from Maya to be in place first. She needed the regulatory review from Sheila's office to have generated its formal paperwork. She needed the infrastructure of accountability to be standing before she opened the door to the public. "Not yet," she said again, as much to herself as to him. "We let them panic first." Andre, on the other end, was quiet for a moment. Then, how much longer? Nia looked at the document package in front of her. The 14 emails. The language that contradicted the public filings. Victor Calloway's name, in his own words, connected directly to a set of decisions that had been buried for years. "Not long," she said. "They're already panicking. They just don't know we can see it." She set down the phone and looked at the monitors. Looked at the board. Looked at the list of 23 shell company entries, 18 of them now confirmed. She thought about the promenade. The crowd going quiet. The trash can. The moment she had stood there in full view of 100 strangers and had not flinched. She opened her working document. At the top of a new page, she typed a single line. Final sequence. Initiate on confirmation from Maya. She underlined it once. And she got back to work. Maya's confirmation came through at 7:14 on a Thursday morning. A single text, Ohio filed. Injunction language included. "We're in." Nia read it sitting at her kitchen table with both hands around her coffee mug. She set the mug down, looked out the window at the pale, early light. Then she picked up her phone and made 3 calls in quick succession. The first was to Sheila, who confirmed that her supervisor had reviewed the document package and formally initiated a multi-subsidiary inquiry. Paperwork signed, logged, and no longer reversible by anyone at the Callaway Group's level of influence. The second was to a contact at a federal financial oversight division who had been sitting on a separate, corroborating file for 11 days waiting for Nia's signal. That signal was now given. The third was to Andre. "Today," she said when he picked up. A pause. Then, "How much of it?" The shell companies. The asset transfers. The disclosure gaps. Daniel Ferris's name. Victor's name. All of it. Another pause, the kind that wasn't hesitation, but absorption. "I need 4 hours. You have 3. She heard him exhale. "Nia, 3 hours, Andre. After that, the regulatory filings will be public record, and you want to be first." He was already moving. She could hear it in the shift of his voice. "I'll call you when it's live." She hung up, looked at the window again. The light was stronger now. She thought about the sequence she had built. 7 months of architecture, each piece placed with the knowledge that it had to hold weight. The regulatory filings, the legal action, the document package, the journalist. Each element designed not just to expose, but to expose in a way that couldn't be walked back, couldn't be quietly negotiated, couldn't be managed by a PR team working overnight. She had not built a moment. She had built a structure. And structures, when they stood on solid ground, didn't collapse when you pushed back against them. She went to her desk, opened the working document, and began dismantling the careful compartments she had built around each piece of the case, releasing them in the order she had planned for months. By noon, the article was live. Andre's piece ran under the headline, "Shell Companies, Hidden Transfers, and a Pattern of Concealment," inside the Callaway Group's financial architecture. It was 6,000 words. It named Victor Callaway directly. It reproduced, in selective and legally defensible excerpts, portions of the 14 email chain that documented the gap between what had been done with the Western portfolio assets and what had been disclosed publicly. It included the cross-referenced subsidiary timeline, the same document Nia had spent 2 days building in the early weeks of the investigation. It quoted Sheila's regulatory division, on record confirming an active multi-subsidiary inquiry. It referenced Maya's Ohio filing. It was the kind of article that doesn't need to shout. It was precise, and it was sourced, and it was arranged in a sequence that built its case the way a well-constructed argument builds. one foundation stone at a time, each one load-bearing. Within 2 hours, it had been picked up by 4 national outlets. Within 4 hours, it was being discussed on financial news networks. Within 6, it was simply everywhere, shared in the kind of accelerating wave that happens when a story clicks into place against something people already half believed. Victor's office received the article's publication alert at 12:04. By 12:07, Patricia was on the phone with the general counsel. By 12:15, Victor himself had read it, or read enough of it, and had called an emergency meeting of his senior leadership team for 2 o'clock. The 2 o'clock meeting was unlike any meeting Victor had run before. He was controlled, technically. He kept his voice level and his sentences short. But the control was the kind that requires visible effort, and the people in the room could see the effort, and that visibility was itself a kind of information. Robert laid out the legal exposure. It was significant. The shell company documentation, if authenticated, and the article's sourcing suggested it had been, created a direct line of liability that went to the top of the company. Several of the board members who had been in conversations with Victor about the current state of the business were now, Robert said carefully, going to require very specific reassurances. Some of them already knew, said a voice from the far end of the table. Everyone looked at the speaker, a senior vice president named Gregory, who had been with the company 12 years and had the kind of organizational memory that made him both valuable and dangerous. What does that mean? Victor asked. Gregory met his gaze. It means some of them signed off on structures they're going to have a very difficult time claiming they didn't understand. He paused, which means their interest in protecting you is now competing with their interest in protecting themselves. The room was very quiet. Victor looked at Gregory for a long moment. We're going to get through this, he said. Everyone in this room is aligned. Nobody said anything to contradict him. But alignment and silence are different things, and Victor was experienced enough to know that. The stock dropped 4.3% before trading was halted for the day. Ethan saw the article's headline on his phone during a free period at school, shared by someone in a group chat he was barely still part of. He read the first 3 paragraphs and stopped. Then he started again from the beginning and read more carefully. He had known, in a general way, that his father's company was large and influential and built on a series of business decisions that Ethan had never had any reason to examine. It had existed in his life the way weather exists, present, shaping everything, not something you thought about directly. The money was there. The houses were there. The sense that consequence had a ceiling and his family's name was somewhere above it. That had been there too, ambient and unexamined. The article put numbers to things. Names. Dates. It described a company that had been run in a specific way, for specific reasons, producing specific outcomes for specific people. And then it described what those outcomes had meant for the people on the other end of them. He put his phone face down on the desk and looked at the whiteboard at the front of the classroom. His teacher was explaining something. He didn't hear any of it. A notification buzzed. He flipped the phone over. The streetwear brand that had dropped him had issued a public statement. 3 sentences, ending with, "We do not align ourselves with individuals or families whose conduct conflicts with our values." He turned the phone face down again. In his social feeds, over the course of that afternoon, the old videos began to resurface. Not just the promenade clip, older things. A video from 2 years earlier, him at a party, making a comment that had seemed, in the room at the time, like a joke. A clip from a school event, him dismissing someone in a way that had been captured at an angle he hadn't noticed. Small things, individually. Together, they were being assembled into a pattern. The internet's particular talent for retrospective portrait building, where each small piece contributes to an image that nobody planned but everyone can suddenly see. 3 more brands posted distancing statements by the end of the day. Margaret had spent the morning in her sitting room, phone in hand, working through a list of names. People she had known for years, allies in the social architecture she had maintained with such careful effort. She was not panicking. Panic was a luxury she had never allowed herself. She was doing what she always did, assessing, calculating, and beginning to move assets, not financial ones, but social ones, into positions that might survive what was coming. She had known, in broad terms, what Victor had done. She had known for a long time. She had told herself, with increasing practice over the years, that knowing and participating were different things. That her role was the house, the family, the public face, not the business. That what happened in board meetings and shell company filings was Victor's domain, not hers. She had told herself this so consistently that it had become, for long stretches, something she almost believed. She called 2 women she had lunched with for 15 years, and neither call was answered. She called a third, and the call was answered, but the conversation was short and careful and ended without any of the warmth that had previously made it comfortable. She sat with the phone in her lap for a while after that. She thought about her son, about the boy she had raised, the one who had grown up in rooms where nobody said no and nobody applied cost to consequences, and the world was organized, subtly and constantly, around the proposition that certain people simply operated differently than others. She had contributed to that. She knew it in the way you know things you've spent years not saying out loud. She thought about the woman at the promenade, the stillness of her, the sentence she had said so quietly that Margaret had only heard it because she had watched the video more times than she had admitted to anyone. You just made a mistake you don't understand yet. She understood now what that sentence had meant. She picked up her phone again, looked at the contact she had made for Nia, the professional address she had used to send a message that had received, in reply, the flattest and most final sentence Margaret had ever been sent in her life. She did not send another message. She simply looked at the contact for a moment. Then she set the phone down. Victor's counterattack, when it came, was the move of a man who had spent decades using the same tools and could not imagine the tools failing. A statement was issued late Thursday afternoon, attributed to a spokesperson for the Callaway Group, describing Nia Brooks as an opportunistic individual with a personal agenda, using a family moment as leverage for financial and reputational gain. The statement stopped short of direct accusations, but was engineered to carry their weight. The kind of language designed to cast doubt, to reframe, to suggest that the woman at the center of the story was herself a figure worthy of scrutiny. By the time the statement was issued, the public narrative had already moved past the point where that kind of reframing could work. Because Nia had no social media. She had no press profile that could be attacked. She had no trail of behavior that could be assembled into a counterportrait. The internet, which had spent the week watching the Callaway story develop, turned to look at Nia Brooks and found only the promenade video. A woman standing in a public place, without her wig, with her hands at her sides, saying 4 quiet words to a boy who had just humiliated her, and then walking to retrieve what was hers. The statement backfired. Significantly, their attacking the woman from the video was the summary of the next several hours of online conversation. The one who didn't even raise her voice. Andre posted a brief addendum to his article. In response to the Callaway Group's statement regarding my source, Ms. Brooks provided no documents directly. Her role in this investigation has been building a case through proper regulatory and legal channels for 7 months. The documents speak for themselves. Nia saw the statement from her desk. She read it once, didn't respond, turned back to her monitor. Her team, a small, distributed group of analysts and researchers she had been working with throughout the investigation, sent messages checking in. One of them asked if they should slow the pace of information release in response to the counterattack. She typed back, no. They've been slowing people down for years. Now they feel it. By Thursday evening, one of the Callaway Group's mid-sized subsidiaries had filed for emergency financial protection. The board of that subsidiary, it emerged, had received legal counsel advising that the current regulatory exposure created liability they could not responsibly carry without formal protection. Victor heard the news in his study, alone, after the house had gone quiet. He stood at the window where he had stood a week earlier, looking at the city. But the feeling was different now. A week ago, he had been managing the edges of unease. Now, he was standing in something he could no longer call anything other than what it was. This isn't damage control anymore, he thought. This is collapse. There was a photograph in Nia's apartment, not displayed, but kept in a drawer in the small table beside her bed. She had looked at it so many times over the years that she didn't need to take it out anymore to see it clearly. Her father, in front of the building where his company had operated for 20 years. He was standing straight, arms at his sides, with the expression of a man who is proud of something and knows it and doesn't need to say so. He was 47 in the photograph. He was wearing a jacket that Nia had always associated with him. Brown leather, soft worn at the elbows. He had been dead for 9 years. She thought about the photograph on Friday morning, not with grief exactly. Grief had its seasons, and this was not one of them. But with the particular clarity that comes when something you have been working toward for a long time is finally in motion and you have a moment to remember why. Her father had built Dunmore Logistics over 20 years. It had started as a one-truck delivery operation and had grown, steadily and carefully, into a mid-sized regional distribution company with 30 employees and a client list that had taken 2 decades to cultivate. He had built it without shortcuts. He had built it with the kind of slow, patient work that doesn't make headlines and doesn't generate the kind of story people tell at parties, but that produces something real and lasting and owned. What had been done to Dunmore Logistics was not unusual in the world of corporate predation. That was the part Nia had spent years making herself sit with. Not the injustice of it in isolation, but the ordinariness of it. What had happened to her father's company had happened to dozens of other companies in the same period, through the same mechanisms, by the same network of subsidiaries and shell structures. The Callaway Group had not targeted Dunmore specifically. That was the cold part. They had targeted a category, mid-sized regional distribution companies with strong client relationships and undervalued assets. And her father's company had simply been in it. The process had been engineered and efficient. Regulatory complaints manufactured to destabilize lending relationships. Supply contracts quietly redirected. Key clients approached by Callaway subsidiaries offering better terms. And then, when the company was weakened enough, an acquisition offer at a fraction of value. The only offer on the table because no other buyer would come near a company that appeared to be in distress. Her father had tried to fight it. He had filed complaints. He had hired a lawyer who had eventually become less responsive and then not responsive at all. He had appealed to clients who said, apologetically, that they couldn't afford loyalty in a competitive market. And then he had signed the acquisition documents because there was nothing left to sign but those. He had told Nia and Maya, when he told them what had happened, that he was going to rebuild, that he was 61 but still had time, that the company was gone but the knowledge of how to build it was not. He had died 11 months later. The doctors had listed the cause as cardiac arrest. Nia had never had any doubt about the fuller story. Andre had come to her apartment for the first time on Friday afternoon. He had asked to see the full documentation, not just the pieces she had fed him through intermediaries, but the complete architecture of what she had built. He needed to understand it fully before he wrote the next piece. She had agreed. He sat at her table and read for 2 hours while she worked at her desk. He was a careful reader. He didn't interrupt. He turned pages without rushing. She respected the silence of it. When he finally set the last document down, he sat for a moment before speaking. The Dunmore acquisition, he said. That's your family. Yes. This whole thing, the 7 months, has never been only about my family. She turned in her chair to face him. What happened to Dunmore happened to 11 other companies through the same mechanism in the same window. I have documentation on 7 of them. Maya has case contacts for 3 more. What Callaway did was a system, not an event. If I made this about my family, it becomes a personal grievance story. If I make it about the system, it becomes accountability. Andre looked at her. But it started with your family. It started with my father's company, yes. I want to include that in the full piece. Nia was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this, about the line between using the personal story as an emotional entry point and weaponizing her own grief for narrative effect. She had thought about it for months. You can include it, she said finally. But the way I want it framed is this. My family is one entry in a list. Not the headline. Not the focus. One documented case among many, with equal weight given to the others. Andre nodded slowly. I can do that. The focus is the system. The focus is the mechanism. The focus is that this is not one powerful man who did bad things. It is a structure that was designed to do exactly what it did, operating exactly as designed for over a decade. And the promenade? Nia looked at him. What about it? It's the public entry point for all of this. People know this story because of that video. I want to explain the connection, not as cause and effect, but as revelation, she said. He paused. Say more. That incident revealed something. Not about me. I already knew what I was doing. It revealed something about the family. About the boy. About what that kind of upbringing produces when it meets a world that has consequences. She paused. The 17-year-old doesn't make that decision in a vacuum. He makes it because a lifetime of messages told him that it was permissible. That's not a defense of him. It's an indictment of everything around him. Andre wrote something in his notebook. Not much. Just a few words. Maya had been in court 3 times that week. Not for the Callaway case, but for 2 other matters that hadn't paused for the storm building around her family's history. She was good at compartmentalization when she needed to be. She had learned it young from watching Nia. She came to the apartment Friday evening with takeout and the particular exhausted brightness of someone who had been running hard and knew the finish line was close. They ate at the kitchen table, and for a while neither of them talked about any of it. They talked about a show they had both been meaning to watch and hadn't. They talked about their mother, who lived in Atlanta and was managing the news coverage with anxious phone calls and the particular parental worry that expresses itself as mild criticism of everything you're doing. They talked about a restaurant that had opened near Maya's office that she said Nia needed to try. Then Maya said, quietly, Daniel Ferris reached out to me. Nia looked up. through a mutual contact. He wants to be named in the coverage, not as an anonymous source on record. Why? He said he spent 7 years being unnamed. He wants the record to show that he told the truth when it mattered. Nia thought about that. What does he want to frame? As a whistleblower, not as someone with a grievance, as someone who saw what was happening and, when the right moment came, acted. Both are true. Both can be true, Maya said. Does it matter? Nia turned her glass slowly in her hands. No, if he's willing to be on record, Andre should have that. It changes the sourcing of the whole piece. Maya nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Victor tried to call me directly. Nia's eyes sharpened slightly. When? Yesterday. Through my office. My paralegal took the message. He, or someone calling on his behalf, said he wanted to discuss a resolution. And Donna told them I was in court. Maya allowed herself a small, dry smile. Which I was. Nia exhaled. Victor reaching directly to Maya meant the legal exposure was biting hard enough that he was willing to skip the pretense of formal channels. He was afraid. That was legible now. In the shape of his moves, the public statement attacking Nia, the direct call to Maya, the emergency board communications that had been leaking through the cracks of the Callaway Group's suddenly less reliable internal security. He's going to offer money, Nia said. I know. He's going to frame it as a settlement. Appropriate acknowledgement of past business practices. Language that sounds like accountability, but functions as a ceiling. Accept the money, sign the clause, the record closes. Maya looked at her. I know, Nia. The Ohio case doesn't settle. The multi-plaintiff injunction doesn't settle. We'll let the courts do what courts are supposed to do. I'm a lawyer, Maya said. I know how courts work. Nia looked at her sister. The exhausted brightness of her. The years of work she carried in the set of her shoulders. 9 years of this. 9 years of building the kind of expertise and credibility that would make this moment possible when it came. I know you do, Nia said. Softer. They were quiet for a moment. Was it strange? Maya asked. Having him try to negotiate? No. Nia looked at the table. He's been negotiating his way out of things his whole career. It's the only move he knows. Maya picked up her fork. Sit back down. He sent Ethan. Nia looked up. What? Not to me. To the school. He had someone reach out to the school administration, apparently to try to get the conduct letter withdrawn or reclassified. The school declined. She paused. Mr. Garrett, apparently, is a man of principle. Nia said nothing. She was thinking about Ethan, about the boy who had stood in front of her with that particular expression of someone who has never once been told the story doesn't end the way he expects, who had walked away from the promenade laughing, followers climbing, the whole thing already a joke in his mind before she'd even retrieved her wig. She wondered what he was thinking now, whether any of this had produced the kind of reckoning that was more than social, whether somewhere in him, at 17, something was cracking open that was larger than embarrassment and deeper than consequence. She didn't know. She had no way to know. And it was not, she reminded herself, her responsibility to manage his growth. That was his to find. Victor came to her, not in person, through his lawyer, formally, with the apparatus of private legal communication that was designed to establish seriousness without admission. The message was detailed. It proposed a settlement framework that would cover the Ohio case, the pending regulatory inquiry, and related matters. It offered figures, large figures, and it included, near the end, a request for a direct conversation. Nia read the message on Saturday morning. She read it slowly and completely. Then she typed her reply. She did not write much. She was not a person who used more words than were necessary. You had years to fix this. I only needed one moment to expose it. My answer is no. The legal process will run its course. She sent it. She looked at the monitor for a moment. At the documents. At the board. At 7 months of work sitting in its final shape. Pieces placed and locked. The structure complete. She thought about her father's photograph in the drawer beside her bed. About the company he had built and the jacket soft at the elbows and the expression of a man who was proud of something and didn't need to say so. She thought about what she had said to Andre the day before. The focus is the system. And it truly was. But underneath the system, beneath every document and subsidiary and shell company and disclosure gap, there was her father standing in front of a building that was his, and then it wasn't, and then he was gone. And she had not done this only for the system. She had done it for him. For that photograph. For the way grief shapes itself over years into work. She did not cry. She had cried that. This was something else, something quieter and more complete. She opened a new document, titled it, Post-Regulatory Phase, Next Steps. She began to type. Andre's final piece ran on a Tuesday. It was not like the first one. The first one had been precise and controlled, a surgical entry point, building a case in careful increments, leaving room for doubt to be argued, even if the argument was thin. This one left no room. It was the complete picture. The shell company register, the asset transfer documentation, the 14-email chain with Victor's name attached to language that directly contradicted public filings, the regulatory timeline, the Ohio acquisition, 11 other companies destroyed through the same mechanism, and the Dunmore logistics case. One entry among many, weighted equally, as Nia had asked, but present. Daniel Ferris was named and quoted. On the record, 7 years of waiting, condensed into 4 paragraphs of testimony that described, in the plain language of someone who had been inside the room, exactly how the structures had been designed and exactly who had designed them. The piece was published at 6 in the morning. By 8, the Callaway Group stock had been halted again. By 9, 2 board members had issued independent statements saying they were cooperating fully with regulatory authorities. By 10, Victor's personal legal team had advised him, in terms that did not leave much interpretive space, that the board meeting scheduled for that afternoon was going to require his full presence and his full attention. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. Nia didn't attend, obviously. She wasn't supposed to be in the room. She had never needed to be in the room. She learned what happened from 2 sources, a brief message from a contact who sat adjacent to the building's legal ecosystem, and the news, which covered it within an hour of the meeting ending. Victor Callaway had been removed as CEO of the Callaway Group by emergency board vote. The vote was not close. He had attempted, at some point during the meeting, to invoke his founding shareholder status as a procedural block. His own lawyers had advised him, quietly and in the room, that the attempt would not succeed given the current regulatory posture and would only accelerate the personal liability exposure he was already managing. He had been escorted out of the building. The media was there. Someone had made sure the media was there. The photographs ran everywhere by early afternoon. Victor Callaway, in a suit he had paid more for than most people earned in a month, walking out of the building he had run for 18 years, with 2 lawyers flanking him and an expression on his face that was doing its best to be composed and not quite managing it. Margaret saw the photographs from the house. She was alone. She had been alone most of the time for the past week. The phone calls had slowed, the lunch invitations had stopped arriving, and the social architecture she had maintained for 20 years had revealed itself, under pressure, to be built on the same thing her husband's financial structures were built on, the assumption that consequence would never arrive. She did not call Victor. She sat in the sitting room with the photographs open on her phone and thought about many things at once. Her son, her choices, the long sequence of small decisions that had accumulated over decades into this specific Tuesday afternoon. She thought about what she knew. She had known about the acquisitions, not in technical detail. She had never wanted technical detail, but in the way a person knows things they have chosen not to ask direct questions about. She had known that Victor's methods were not always clean. She had known that the wealth she spent so carefully had a history she didn't examine. She had told herself, for years, that not examining it was not the same as participating in it. She was no longer sure that argument held. Ethan was called to the dean's office for the second time on Wednesday morning. This meeting was shorter than the first. Mr. Garrett had the formal board decision in hand, a document that had been discussed in 2 emergency sessions over the previous week. The conduct file, combined with the sustained public nature of the incident and the school's assessment that Ethan's response had demonstrated no meaningful accountability, had produced a conclusion. Ethan sat in the chair across from Mr. Garrett and listened to the language of formal expulsion read to him in the careful, measured tone of a man who believed in consequences and also believed they should be delivered without cruelty. He didn't speak during the meeting. Mr. Garrett, who had been watching teenagers for 22 years, noted this. The silence was not defiance. It was something quieter than defiance. Something that had the texture of a person who was beginning, slowly and at some cost, to understand the weight of what they carried. Ethan walked out of the building into a gray morning. He sat in the back of the car his mother had sent. She had come herself for the first meeting, but this time she had sent the driver, and looked out the window at the street. He was thinking about the woman at the promenade. He had been thinking about her more than he admitted in the weeks since. Not with fear exactly, not with the kind of calculating fear his father would have understood, but with the particular discomfort of someone who has done something they cannot undo and is only now, slowly, beginning to understand what it actually was. He had reached for her wig because it had been there, and because he could, and because the crowd was watching, and because nothing had ever stopped him before. Those were all true. He had understood that much for a while now. What he was only beginning to understand was what it said about the world he had grown up in, about the people who had shaped it for him, about the 17 years of frictionless living that had made a public act of cruelty feel, in the moment, like a joke. He didn't share any of that. He didn't post about it. He just sat in the back of the car and looked at the street and thought. The authorities moved formally against Victor on Thursday. The charges, multiple counts of securities fraud, 2 counts related to illegal asset acquisition structure, 1 count of obstruction tied to the regulatory filing gaps, were filed in federal court. The filing was public. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a brief statement. It was dry and factual and said everything. Maya was in her office when the filing notification came through on her legal database. She read it twice. Then she walked to the window that looked down at the street, at the ordinary Thursday morning movement of people and cars and a delivery truck double parked outside the florist downstairs. She called Nia. They filed, she said. I know, Nia said. I saw. A pause. How do you feel? I'm not sure yet. Me neither, Maya said. I thought I'd feel more. It's not done. He'll have lawyers for years. The courts will take time. I know how courts work, Maya said for the second time in a week, but this time it was gentler. Not impatience. Just acknowledgement that the machinery of justice was slower than the machinery of collapse, and both were real. The Ohio case is moving well. Nia asked. Really well. The judge assigned is thorough. We had our first substantive hearing yesterday. Maya paused. We have 9 plaintiffs now. 3 more are in conversations. 9 families. Maya's voice was careful. 9 companies. Some of them smaller than Dad's. Some of them bigger. Nia didn't say anything for a moment. Then good. That's what it should look like. Afterward, she sat at her desk for a while without working. She looked at the monitors, at the boards that were mostly cleared now, the architecture she had built over 7 months dismantled into its component pieces, delivered to the places they needed to go. The desk felt different without the density of active investigation on it. Quieter. Not empty. She was already thinking about what came next, but quieter. She opened the drawer of the small table beside her bed that evening, took out the photograph, looked at her father, the jacket, the building, the expression. She held it for a while. Then she put it back. Victor's lawyer had told him not to speak publicly, and for once in his life, he was following the instruction. He sat in his house, a house that was already the subject of asset review, and managed the very specific experience of a man who had built an empire on the belief that scale provided insulation, discovering that scale, at a certain point, only increases the surface area of collapse. He was not a man given to self-examination. He had been successful for too long at the particular art of forward motion. Always the next deal, always the next structure, always the next layer of protection between himself and the things he had done. Self-examination required stillness, and he had spent his adult life treating stillness as a liability. But the stillness had arrived, uninvited, in the form of an empty calendar and a phone that rang only with his lawyer's numbers. He thought, occasionally, about the woman from the promenade. Not with guilt, exactly. Not with anything he would have named guilt, but with the particular bewilderment of someone who has spent decades being the largest force in any room and has encountered, for the first time, something that didn't move when he pushed against it. He had not understood what she was. He had dismissed her, categorized her, tried to discredit her, tried to buy her silence. None of it had worked because none of it had been designed for someone who wasn't motivated by what he assumed everyone was motivated by. He didn't understand it yet, fully, but he was sitting in the stillness of its consequences. 3 weeks later, the promenade was ordinary again. The story had not left the news entirely. Legal proceedings had a way of keeping a story present, surfacing every few weeks when a filing moved or a hearing was scheduled, but the acute phase had passed. The daily breaking updates had given way to the longer, slower rhythm of institutional accountability, which was, in many ways, the part that mattered most. Moments produced attention. Process produced change. The first settlement payments in the Ohio case went out in the 4th week. Small, relative to the scale of what had been lost. First payments always were in complex multi-plaintiff cases, but real. Checks that arrived in the mail of people who had spent years being told that what had happened to them was simply the market. Maya was managing 3 parallel case tracks by then, with 2 additional associates brought on to handle the volume. She was also in early conversations with 2 other lawyers about a coordinated legal framework for corporate predation cases, a structure that would make the kind of work she and Nia had done more replicable, less dependent on having someone with 7 months and a specific personal stake to build the map from scratch. She was, for the first time in a long time, doing work that felt as large as the thing it was trying to address. Andre had been offered a book deal within 2 weeks of the final article. He had turned it down, for now. He was already working on the next investigation, a different company, a different structure, but recognizably the same category of thing. He credited Nia publicly in every interview he gave about the Calloway story. He said, plainly and without hedging, that the documentation she had assembled had been the foundation of everything. He said she had shown him what the map looked like. He did not tell people where she was or what she was doing next. She had asked him not to, and he respected it. Ethan had started volunteering at a community center on the east side of the city. He had not announced it. He had not posted about it. He had simply shown up a week after his expulsion, having found the place through a referral from a school counselor he had talked to quietly during the final week before he left. He worked in the after-school program. He was not good at it. Initially, he had no particular skills for working with younger kids, and the absence of status that he had always carried like a backpack was disorienting. Nobody at the community center cared about his name. Nobody cared about his family, beyond a passing awareness that something bad had happened to it. They cared about whether he showed up and whether he was useful. He kept showing up. He did not have a dramatic revelation. He did not make a public statement of accountability or post a tearful apology video. He simply showed up and tried to be useful in thought, regularly and with increasing honesty, about the things he had understood and the things he was still learning. He was 17. There was time. Whether he used it was still an open question, but the question, at least, was now present in him in a way it had not been before. Margaret had written a letter to Nia. A real letter, handwritten, sent through a lawyer to the professional address on file. It was long. It acknowledged things she had spent years not acknowledging. It did not ask for forgiveness. She had been deliberate about that, understanding that forgiveness was not a thing she had any right to request. It simply said what was true. She never received a response. She had not expected one. Victor's trial date was set. His lawyers were managing the posture of a man, trying to negotiate between cooperation and self-preservation, a position that typically produces neither outcome efficiently. The proceedings would take time. His personal assets were frozen. The house was under review. The wealth that had organized his family's life for 2 decades was, in the language of the legal filings, pending determination of origin. His legacy, the thing he had spent his adult life building in the form of an empire whose name would outlast him, was permanently altered. Not destroyed, exactly in the legal sense. But the Calloway Group that emerged from receivership and restructuring would bear his name only in the historical record, and the historical record now had a specific shape. Nia was walking through the Eastgate Market on a Saturday morning, for weeks after the board removal, 6 weeks after the promenade. It was a different kind of outdoor space than the Westfield Promenade. Less curated, more lived in, the kind of place where people came for vegetables and hardware and the bakery with a perpetual line and not to be seen. She came here most Saturday mornings. She bought tomatoes and good bread and, occasionally, cut flowers for the desk she was no longer filling with investigation materials. She was wearing her wig. She had not stopped wearing it because of what had happened. She had never stopped wearing it, even in the weeks since, except at home. It was simply hers, and she wore it, and that was unremarkable. She was thinking about the next project. There was always a next project. She had been approached by 2 organizations in the past month. One a nonprofit focused on corporate accountability in the healthcare sector, one a legal defense fund working on environmental fraud cases. She hadn't decided yet. She was letting herself think slowly, which was a luxury she rarely permitted during active work. She was looking at the tomatoes when someone touched her arm lightly. She turned. A woman, mid-40s, someone she didn't recognize. The woman's expression had a particular quality, the look of someone who is deciding whether to say something. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. "But you're the woman from that video, aren't you? The one with the Calloway kid." Nia looked at her. Calm, unhurried. "I just wanted to say," the woman stopped, then started again. "My brother had a company. Small logistics operation in Indiana. It was acquired. We never could prove how it happened, but after what came out, the mechanism, the way they describe how it worked," she paused. "I just want to say thank you. It didn't fix it. I know it didn't fix it, but someone said it out loud. That it happened. That it was real." Nia held the woman's gaze for a moment. "I'm glad it mattered," she said. "I'm sorry about your brother's company." The woman nodded, started to move away, then turned back. "Were you scared? Any of it?" Nia considered the question honestly. "Not of them," she said. "Only of moving too fast and getting it wrong." The woman looked at her a moment longer. Then she walked on. Nia stood in the Saturday morning light, among the tomatoes and the crowd and the ordinary, unremarkable movement of a city going about its weekend. She thought about what the woman had said. It didn't fix it. That was true. The settlements were real, but incomplete. The legal process was real, but slow. The accountability was real, but it had arrived 9 years after a man had died and 20 years after a company had been taken apart piece by piece with great efficiency and very little consequence. It hadn't fixed it, but had named it. And naming was not nothing. Naming was sometimes the thing that made everything else possible. Maya called that evening, as she often did on Saturday evenings. "Are you coming to Mom's next weekend?" she asked. "Yes." She's going to ask about everything. She's been watching the news. "I know." A pause. Then Maya said, quietly, "Was it worth it?" It was the question Nia had been waiting for Maya to ask. Not because it was surprising. She had known her sister would ask it eventually, but because she had been composing the answer in herself for weeks, testing it for honesty. It wasn't about winning, she said. It was about stopping them. Maya was quiet for a moment. Dad would have been. "I know." Neither of them said anything for a little while after that. The city was quiet outside Nia's window. The monitors were off. The board were cleared. The drawer beside her bed held the photograph of a man in a brown leather jacket, standing in front of something he had built. Nia looked at the window. The ordinary dark of a Saturday evening. Lights across the buildings. A city going about its life. She picked up her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and began again to work. If this story made you feel something, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that will stay with you long after they're over.